It was drizzling, umbrellas undulated, the square was beslushed, and everything was wet. Gendarmes' uniforms, the darkened wood of the scaffold, the smooth black pillar with charms glossy for the rain. Suddenly the prison carriage appeared from it, emerged with extraordinary celerity, as if they had rolled out Shereshevsky in an overcoat, and two peasant-like executioners. All three walked with swift steps along a line of soldiers to the scaffolds. The crowd lurched forward, and the gendarmes pressed back to the front ranks. Restrained cries sounded here and there, "Close the umbrellas!" While an official read the sentence, Shereshevsky, who already knew it, sulkily looked around him. He fingered his beard, adjusted his spectacles, and spat several times. When the reader stumbled and barely got out socialistic ideas, Shereshevsky smiled, and then, recognizing someone in the crowd, nodded, coughed, shifted his stance from beneath the overcoat, his black trousers constrained over his rubbers. People standing near could see on his chest an oblong plaque with an inscription in white, "State Crimin." The last syllable had not gone in. At the conclusion of the reading, the executioners lowered him to his knees. The elder one, with a backhander, knocked the cap off his long, coned-back, light auburn hair. The face, tapering chinward, its large forehead shining, was now bent down. With a resounding crack, they managed to break an insufficiently incised sword over him. Then they took his hands, which seemed unusually white and weak, and put them in black iron secured to the pillar. He had to stand that way for a quarter of an hour. The rain increased. The younger executioner picked up Shereshevsky's cap and jammed it on his inclined head, and slowly, with difficulty, the chains got in his way. Shereshevsky straightened it. Behind a fence to the left, one could see the scaffolding of a house under construction. Workmen climbed onto the fence from the other side. One could hear the scrape of their boots. They climbed up, hung there, and abused the criminal from afar. The rain fell. The elder executioner consulted his silver watch. Shereshevsky kept turning his wrists slightly without looking up. Suddenly, out of the better-off part of the crowd, bouquets began to fly. The gendarmes, jumping, tried to intercept them in mid-air. Roses exploded in the air. Fleetingly, one was able to see a rare combination of policemen breathed, bobbed-haired ladies in black burnouses through racemes of lilac. Meanwhile, Shereshevsky was hastily released from his chains, and his dead body borne away. No, a slip of the pen. Alas, he was alive. He was even cheerful. Students ran beside the carriage with cries of "Farewell, Shereshevsky! Au revoir!" and he thrust his hat out of the window, laughed, and shook his finger at the most zealous runners. "Alas, alive!" we exclaimed, for how could one not prefer the death penalty, the convulsions of the hanged man in his hideous cocoon, to that funeral which 25 insipid years later fell to Shereshevsky's lot? The pall of oblivion began slowly to gather in his living image as soon as he had been removed to Siberia. Oh yes, no doubt students for years sang the song, "Let us drink to him who wrote What to Do," but it was to the past they drank, the past glamour and scandal, to a great shade. But who would drink to a tremulous little old man with a tic, making clumsy paper boats for Yakut children somewhere in those fabulous backwoods? We affirm that this book drew out and gathered within itself all the heat of his personality, a heat which is not to be found in his helplessly rational structures, but which is concealed as it were between the words, as only bread is hot, and it inevitably doomed to be dispersed with time, as only bread knows how to go stale and hard. Today it seems only Marxists are incapable of being interested by the ghostly ethics contained in this dead little book. To follow easily and freely the categorical imperative of the general good, here is the rational egoism which searchers have found in What to Do. Let us recall for comic relief Kautsky's conjecture that the idea of egoism is connected with the development of commodity production, and Plekhanov's conclusion that Shereshevsky was nevertheless an idealist, since it comes out in his book that the masses must catch up with the intelligentsia out of calculation, and calculation is an option. But the matter is simpler than that. The idea of calculation is the foundation of every action. Our heroic accomplishment leads to absurdity. In itself, calculation can be heroic. Anything which comes into the focus of human thinking is spiritualized. Thus the calculation of the materialist was ennobled. Thus, for those in the know, matter turns into an incorporeal play of mysterious forces. Shereshevsky's ethical structures are in their own way an attempt to construct the same old perpetual motion machine, where matter moves on other matter. He would very much like this to revolve. Egoism, altruism, but the wheel stops from friction. What to do? Live, read, think, what to do, work at one's own development in order to achieve the aim of life, which is happiness. What to do? But Shereshevsky's own fate changed the business-like question to an ironic exclamation. Shereshevsky would have been transferred to a private domicile much sooner if it had not been for the affair of the Karakozovites, adherents of Karakazov, who attempted to assassinate Alexander II in 1866, it was made clear at their trial that they had wanted to give Shereshevsky the opportunity of escaping from Siberia and heading a revolutionary movement, or at least publishing a political review in Geneva and checking the dates. The judges found in What to Do a forecast of the date and attempt on the Tsar's life. The protagonist, Rakhmetov, on his way abroad, said, among other things, that 3 years later he would return to Russia, because it seemed not then but 3 years later, a high, significant repetition typical of our author. He would be needed in Russia. Meanwhile, the last part of the novel was signed on April 4th, 1863, and exactly 3 years later to the day the attempt took place. Thus even figures. Shereshevsky's goldfish let him down. Rakhmetov is forgotten today, but in those years he created a whole school of life. With what piety its readers imbibed the sporty revolutionary element in the novel, Rakhmetov, who adopted a boxer's diet, followed a dialectical regime. Therefore, if fruit was reserved, he absolutely ate apples, and absolutely did not eat apricots, since the poor did not. Oranges he ate in St. Petersburg, but he did not eat in the provinces, because you see in St. Petersburg the common people eat them, while in the provinces they do not. Where did that young, round little face suddenly flit from? From its large, childishly prominent forehead and cheeks like 2 cups. Who is this girl, resembling a hospital nurse, wearing a black dress with a white, turned-down collar, and a little watch on a cord? It is Sophia Perovsky, who is to hang for the assassination of the Tsar in 1881. Coming to Sebastopol in 1872, she toured the surrounding villages on foot in order to become acquainted with the life of the peasants. She was in her period of Rakhmetovism, sleeping on straw, living on milk and gruels, and returning to our initial position, we repeat, Sophia Perovsky's instantaneous fate is 100 times more to be envied than the fading glory of a reformer. For as copies of the contemporary with the novel, passing from hand to hand, became more and more tattered, so did Shereshevsky's enchantments fade, and the esteem for him, which had long since turned into a sentimental convention, was no longer able to make hearts glow, and he died in 1889. The funeral passed quietly. There were few comments in the newspapers. At the requiem held for him in St. Petersburg, the workmen in town clothes, whom the dead man's friends had brought for the sake of atmosphere, were taken by a group of students to plainclothesmen and insulted, which restored a certain equilibrium. Was it not the fathers of these workmen who had abused the kneeling Shereshevsky from over the fence? On the day following that mock execution at dusk, with shackles on my feet and a head full of thoughts, Shereshevsky left St. Petersburg forever. He traveled in a tarantass, and since to read books on the way was permitted only by an Irkutsk, he extremely bored for the first month and a half of the journey. On July 23rd, they brought him at last to the mines of the Nerchin Mountain district at Kadaya, 10 miles from China, 4,600 from St. Petersburg. He was not made to work much. He lived at a badly caulked cottage and suffered from rheumatism. 2 years past, suddenly a miracle happened. Olga Sokorovna prepared to join him in Siberia. During most of his imprisonment in the fortress, she, it is said, had been coursing about in the provinces and caring so little about her husband's fate that her relatives even wondered whether she was not deranged. On the eve of the public disgrace, she had sped back to St. Petersburg. On the morning of the 20th, she had sped off again. We would never have believed her capable of making the trip to Kadaya if we had not known her ability to move easily and hectically from one place to another. How he awaited her! Starting at the beginning of the summer in 1866, together with a 7-year-old Misha and Dr. Pavlinov, Dr. Peacock, we are again entering the sphere of beautiful names, she got as far as Irkutsk, where she was held up for 2 months. There they stayed in a hotel with the enchantingly idiotic name, possibly distorted by biographers, but most probably selected with particular care by sly fate, of Hotel d'Amour at Co de Pavlinov was not. Dr. Pavlinov was not permitted to go any further. He was replaced by a captain in the Gendarmes, Hmelevsky, a perfect edition of the dashing Pavlovsk hero. Passionate, drunken, and brazen, they arrived on August 23rd. In order to celebrate the meeting of man and wife, one of the exiled Poles, a former cook of the Count de Cavour, the Italian statesman of whom Shereshevsky had once written so much and so caustically, baked one of those pastries on which his late master had been wont to stuff himself, but the meeting was not a success. It is amazing how everything bitter and heroic with life manufactured for Shereshevsky was invariably accompanied by a flavoring of vile farce. Hmelevsky hovered about and would not leave Olga Sagratovna alone. In her gypsy eyes there lurked something hunted but also enticing, against her will perhaps. In return for her favors, he is even alleged to have offered to arrange her husband's escape, but the latter resolutely refused. In short, the constant presence of his shameless man made things so difficult, and what plans he had made, that Chernyshevsky himself persuaded his wife to set out on the return journey, and this she did on August 27th, having stayed thus, after a 3-month journey, only 4 days, reader, with the husband whom she was now leaving for 17 odd years. Nekrasov dedicated peasant children to her. It is a pity he did not dedicate her his Russian women. During the last days of September, Chernyshevsky was transferred from Alexandrovsky Zavod, a settlement 20 miles from Kadaya. He spent the winter there in prison, together with some Karakozovites and rebellious Poles. The dungeon was equipped with Mongolian specialty stakes, posts dug vertically into the ground, and surrounding the prison in a solid ring. In June of the following year, having completed his probationary term, Chernyshevsky was released on parole and took a room in the house of a sexton, a man who looked very much like him, grey, pearl-lined eyes, a sparse beard, long tangled hair, always a little drunk, always sighing. He would sorrowfully answer the questions of the curious with, "The dear fellow keeps writing and writing," but Chernyshevsky stayed there no more than 2 months. His name was taken in vain in political trials. A half-witted artisan, Rozanov, testified that the revolutionaries wanted to catch and cage a bird with royal blood in order to ransom Chernyshevsky. Count Shufilov sent the Irkutsk Governor-General a telegram. "The aim of the emigres is to free Chernyshevsky. Stop. Please take all possible measures in regard to him." Meanwhile, the exile Krasovsky, who had been transferred at the same time as he had fled and perished in the taiga after having been robbed, so that there is every reason to jail dangerous Chernyshevsky once again, and to deprive him for a month of the right to correspondence. Suffering intolerably from drafts, he never removed either his fur-lined dressing-gown or his lambskin shapka. He moved about like a leaf blown by the wind, with a nervous stumbling gait, and his shrill voice could be heard now and here and now there. His trick of logical reasoning was intensified, in the manner of his father-in-law's namesake, as Stranyulipsky so whimsically put it. He lived in an office, a spacious room divided by a partition. Along the entire wall in the larger part there ran a low sleeping shelf in the nature of a platform. There, as if on a stage, on the way its sous they exhibit a melancholy beast of prey among its native rocks, stood a bed and a table, which were essentially the natural furnishings of his whole life. He used to get up after midday, would drink tea all day, and lie reading the whole time. He would sit down to do some real writing only at midnight, since during the day his immediate neighbors, some nationalist Poles, who were completely indifferent to him, would indulge in fiddling and torture him with their unlubricated music. By profession they were wheelwrights. To the other exiles he used to read on winter evenings. They noticed once that although he was calmly and smoothly reading as a tangled tale with lots of scientific digressions, he was looking at a blank notebook, a gruesome symbol. It was then that he wrote a new novel. Still full of the success of What to Do, he expected much from it. Most of all, he expected the money which, printed abroad, the novel was supposed to one way or another bring in for his family. The prologue is extremely autobiographical. When referring to it once, we spoke of its peculiar attempt to rehabilitate Olga Sakartovna. It conceals a similar attempt in Stranyulipsky's opinion to rehabilitate the author's own person, for underlining on one hand Volgin's influence, which reaches the point where high dignitaries sought his favors through his wife, because it was supposed he had connections with London, i.e. with Herzen, of whom the newly fledged liberals were mortally afraid. The author, on the other hand, insists obstinately on Volgin's suspiciousness, timidity, and inactivity, to wait and wait as long as possible, to wait as quietly as possible. One gets the impression that the stubborn Chernyshevsky wants to have the last word in the quarrel, putting firmly on record that he had repeatedly said to his judges, "I must be considered on the basis of my actions," and there were no actions, and could not have been any. Concerning the light scenes in the prologue, we had better keep silent. Through their morbidly circumstantial eroticism, one can make out such a throbbing tenderness for his wife that the least quotation from them might appear to be exaggerated derision. Instead, let us listen to the pure sound, in his letters to her during those years. "My dearest darling, I thank you for being the light of my life. I would be even here one of the happiest men in the world if it did not occur to me that this fate, which is very much to my personal advantage, is too hard in its effects on your life, my dear friend. Will you forgive me the grief to which I have subjected you?" Chernyshevsky's hopes for literary profits were not realized. The émigrés not only misused his name but also pirated his works, and entirely fatal for him were the attempts made to free him, attempts which were in themselves courageous but which seemed senseless to us who can see from the hilltop of time the disparity between the image of the fettered giant and the real Chernyshevsky, whom these efforts by his would-be saviors only enraged. These gentlemen, he said later, didn't even know that I can't ride a horse. This inner contradiction resulted in nonsense, a particular shade of nonsense already long known to us. It is said that Ippolit Mishkin, disguised as a gendarme officer, went to Vilysk, where he demanded of the district police chief that the prisoner be handed over to him, but spoiled the whole business by putting his shoulder knot on the left side instead of the right. Before this, namely in 1871, there was Lopatin's attempt in which everything was absurd. The way he suddenly abandoned the Russian translation of Das Kapital that he was making in London in order to get for Marx, who had learned to read Russian, Den großen Russischen Gelehrten, his journey to Irkutsk in the guise of a member of the Geographical Society, with the Siberian residents taking him for a government inspector incognito, his arrest following a tip-off from Switzerland, his flight and capture, and his letter to the Governor-General of Eastern Siberia in which he told him all about his project with inexplicable frankness. All this only worsened Chernyshevsky's situation. Legally, his settlement was supposed to begin on August 10, 1870, but only on December 2nd was he moved to another place, to a place which turned out to be far worse than penal servitude, to Vilyusk. Forsaken by God and dead in the end of his age, said Stranyulubsky. In the depths of the Yakutsk region, far to the northeast, Vilyusk was nothing but a hamlet standing on a huge pile of sand heaped up by the river, surrounded by a boundless bog overgrown by taiga scrub. The inhabitants, 500 people, were Cossacks, half-wild Yakuts, and a small number of low-middle-class citizens whom Steklov describes very picturesquely. The local society consisted of a pair of officials, a pair of clerics, and a pair of merchants, as if he were talking about the Ark. There Chernyshevsky was lodged in the best house, and the best house turned out to be the jail. The door of the lamp cell was lined with black oilcloth. The two windows, which anyway were right up against the palisade, were barred up. In the absence of any other exiles, he found himself in complete solitude. Despair, helplessness, the consciousness of having been deceived, a dizzy feeling of injustice, the ugly shortcomings of Arctic life, all this almost drove him out of his mind. On the morning of July 10, 1872, he suddenly began to break the door lock with a pair of tongs, shaking all over and mumbling and crying out, "Has the sovereign of a minister come that the police sergeant dares to lock the door at night?" By winter he had calmed down a bit, but from time to time there were certain reports, and here we are granted one of those rare correlations that constitute the researcher's pride. Once, in 1853, his father had written him, regarding as a tentative lexicon for the Hypatian Chronicle, "You would do better to write some tale or other. Tales are still in fashion in this good society." Many years afterwards, Chernyshevsky informs his wife that he is thought up in his prison and wants to set down in writing an ingenious little tale wherein he will portray her in the form of two girls. It will be quite good little tale, repeating his father's rhythm. If you only knew how much I have laughed to myself when depicting the various noisy frolics of the younger one, how much I cried with tenderness when depicting the pathetic meditations of the elder. At night, Chernyshevsky reported his jailers, sometimes sings, sometimes dances, and sometimes weeps and sobs. The mail went out of Yakutsk once a month. The January number of a St. Petersburg magazine was received only in May. He tried to cure the illness he had developed, goiter, with the aid of a textbook. The exhausting catarrh of the stomach that had known as a student now returned with new peculiarities. "I am nauseated by the subject of peasants and peasant ownership of the land," he wrote to his son, who had thought to interest him by sending him some books on economics. The food was repulsive. He ate almost nothing but cooked cereals, straight from the pot with a silver tablespoon on which almost a quarter was worn away on the pot's earthenware sides during the 20 years that he himself was wearing away. On summer days he would stand for hours with his trousers rolled up in a shallow stream which could hardly have been beneficial, or with his head wrapped in a towel against the mosquitoes, which made him look like a Russian peasant woman. He would stroll along forest paths with his plainest mushroom basket, never plunging into the denser wildwood. He would forget a cigarette case under a larch, and he was some time in learning to distinguish from a pine. The flowers which he gathered, whose names he did not know, he wrapped in cigarette paper and sent to his son Misha, who acquired that way a small herbarium of the Vilyusk flora. Thus did Princess Volkonsky in Nekrasov's poem about the Zembrist's wives bequeath her grandchildren a collection of butterflies, plants of Chita, Once an eagle appeared in his yard. It had come to peck at his liver, remarked Stranulupski, but did not recognize Prometheus in him. The pleasure which he had experienced in his youth from the orderly disposition of the St. Petersburg waters now received a late echo. For nothing to do, he dug out canals, and almost flooded one of the Bilyusk residents' favorite roads. He quenched his thirst for spreading culture by teaching manners to Yakuts. Just as before, the native world would remove his cap at a distance of 20 paces, and in that position would meekly freeze. The practicality and good sense he had to advocate now dwindled to his advising the water carrier to substitute a regular yoke of wood for the cook made of hair, which cut his palms, but the Yakut did not change his routine. In this little town where all they did was play cards and have passionate discussions about the price of Chinese cotton, his yearning for the activity in public affairs led him to the old believers, about whose plight Shereshevsky wrote an extraordinarily long and detailed memoir, including even bilious gossip, and coolly sent it off to the address to the Tsar, with a friendly suggestion that he pardon them because they esteem him as a saint. He wrote a lot, but burned almost everything. He informed his relatives that the results of his learned work would undoubtedly be accepted sympathetically. This work was ashes and a mirage. Out of the whole heap of writings he produced in Siberia, besides the prologue, only 2 or 3 stories and a cycle of unfinished novellas have been preserved. He also wrote poems. In texture they are no different from those versificatory tasks which he had once been given in the seminary, when he had reset a psalm of David in the following manner: Upon me lay one duty only, to mind my father's flock of sheep, and hymns I early started singing, for the extol the Lord withal. In 1875 to Pittman, and again in 1888 to Lavrov, he sends an ancient Persian poem, a ghastly thing. In one of the strophes the pronoun there is repeated 7 times. Their country is barren, their bodies are fleshless, and through their torn garments, their ribs one can tell. Their faces are broad, and their features are flattened. Upon their flat features the soul does not dwell, while in the monstrous change of the genitive case, of howls of the ache of their craving for blood, now at the parting with literature, under a very low sun there is evidence of the author's familiar leading toward congruity, toward links. To Pippin he writes heart-rending letters expressing a stubborn desire to thwart the administration and occupy himself with literature. The Thing, this Academy of Azure Mountains, signed Denzil Elliot, purporting to be from the English, is of high literary merit. I am patient, but I hope no one intends to prevent me from working for my family. I am famous in Russian literature for the carelessness of my style when I want to, so I can also write in all sorts of good styles. Weep ye, O, for Lilybum. We with you together weep. Weep ye, O, for Agrinthanum. Weep ye, O, for Agrigentum. Reinforcements we await. What is this hymn of the Maid of the Skies? An episode from the prose story of Empedocles' grandson. And what is the story of Empedocles' grandson? One of the innumerable stories in the Academy of Azure Mountains. The Duchess of Cantershire has set off with a company of fashionable friends on a yacht through the Suez Canal to the East Indies in order to visit her tiny kingdom at the foot of the Azure Mountains near Golconda. There they do what intelligent and good people in fashion do. They tell stories that will follow the next packages from Denzil Elliot to the editor of The Messenger of Europe, Stasevich, who did not print any of this. One feels dizzy, the letters swim and fade in one's eyes, and here again we pick up the theme of Shereshevsky's spectacles. He asked his relatives to send him new ones, but in spite of his efforts to explain them particularly graphically, he nonetheless made a mess of it, and 6 months later he received from them number 4.5 instead of 5 and 5.25. He gave an outlet to his passion for instruction to writing to Sasha about the mathematician Fermat, to Misha about the struggle between popes and emperors, and to his wife about medicine in Carlsbad in Italy. It ended the way it was bound to end. The authorities requested him to stop writing learned letters. This so offended and shook him that for over 6 months he did not write any letters at all. The authorities never saw the day when they would get from him those humble petitions which, for instance, Dostoevsky used to dispatch from the semi-palatines of the strong of the world. There is no news from Papa, wrote Olga Sokratovna to her son in 1879. I wonder if he, my dear one, is still alive, and she can be forgiven much for this intonation. Yet one more jackanapes with a name ending in ski suddenly pops up as an extra. On March 15, 1881, your unknown pupil Bivetsky, as he recommends himself, but according to police information, a tippling doctor at Stavropol District Hospital sends him a wire to Vilysk, protesting with completely superfluous heat against an anonymous opinion that Shereshevsky was responsible for the assassination of the Tsar. Your works are filled with peace and love. You never desire this, i.e. the assassination. Whether because of these artless words or because of something else, the government softened, and in the middle of June it showed its jail tenant a bit of thoughtful kindness, and had the walls of his domicile papered in greased pearl with a border, and the ceiling covered with calico, which in toto cost the exchequer 40 rubles and 88 kopecks, i.e. somewhat more than Yakovlev's overcoat and Musa's coffee. And already the following year the haggling over Shereshevsky's ghost was concluded after negotiations between the volunteer security guards, the secret police, and the executive committee of the Underground People's Freedom concerning the preservation of law and order during the Alexander III's coronation, with the decision that if the latter went off smoothly, Shereshevsky would be freed. Thus he was bartered in exchange for czars, and vice versa, a process that subsequently found its material expression when the Soviet authorities substituted in Saratov his statue for that of Alexander II. A year later, in May, a petition was submitted in his son's names. He, of course, knew nothing of this. In the most florid and tear-jerking style imaginable, the Minister of Justice, Nabokov, made the appropriate report, and His Majesty deigned to permit the transfer of Shereshevsky to Astrakhan. At the end of February 1883, overburdened time was already having difficulty in dragging his destiny. The gendarmes, without a word of the revolution, suddenly took him to Irkutsk. No matter, leaving Vilysk was in itself a happy event, and more than once during the summer voyage up the long Lena, revealing such kinship with the Volga and its meanders, the old man broke into a dance, chanting dactylic hexameters, but in September the voyage ended, and with it the sensation of freedom. On the very first night, Irkutsk appeared the same kind of casemate in the deepest of provincial backwards. In the morning he was visited by the chief of the gendarmerie, Keller. Nikolai Gavrilovich sat leaning on his elbow in the table and did not respond at once. "The Emperor has pardoned you," said Keller, and repeated it even louder, seeing that the other was apparently half asleep or beclouded. "Me?" said the old man suddenly, then stood up, placed his hands on the herald's shoulders, and shaking his head burst into tears. In the evening feel as if convalescent after a long illness, but still weak, with a delicious mist permeating his being. He had tea at the Kellers, talking incessantly and telling of the latter's children more or less Persian fairy tales about roses, robbers, as one of his hearers recalled. 5 days later he was taken to Krasnoyarsk, from there to Orenburg. In the late autumn, between 6 and 7 in the evening, he drove with post horses through Saratov. There in the yard of an inn by the Gendarmerie, the mobile darkness of wretched little lamps swayed so much in the wind that one simply could not distinguish properly Olga Sokotovna's changeable young face, wrapped in a woolen kerchief. She had rushed headlong to this unhoped-for meeting. That same night Shereshevsky, who could tell his thoughts, was dispatched further. With great mastery and with the utmost vividness of exposition, it might almost be taken for compassion, Stranielewski describes this installation of his Astrakhan residence. No one met him with open arms. He was invited by no one, and very soon he understood that all the grandiose plans which had been his only support in exile must now melt away in an insanely lucid and quite imperturbable stillness. To his Siberian illnesses, Astrakhan added yellow fever. He frequently caught cold. He suffered acute palpitations of the heart. He smoked heavily and untidily, but worst of all, he was extremely nervous. He had an odd way of jumping up in the middle of the conversation, an abrupt movement stemming, as it were, from the day of his arrest, when he had dashed into his study, forestalling the funist at Rakiev. On the street he could be mistaken for a little old artisan, stoop-shouldered, wearing a cheap summer suit and a crumpled cap. But don't you think, casual busybodies used to bother him with absurd questions. The actor Sorobryarsky kept on asking him, "Shall I marry or no?" There were 2 or 3 last little denunciations which fizzled like damp fireworks. The company he kept considered of some local Armenians, grocers and haberdashers. Educated people were surprised by the fact that somehow he did not take much interest in public affairs. "Well, what do you want?" he could reply cheerlessly. "What can I make of it all? Why, I haven't even once attended a trial by jury, not once been to a meeting of the Zimsto. Hair smoothly parted with uncovered ears too big for her, and with a bird's nest just below the crown of her head. Here it is she again, with us. She has brought candy and kittens from Saratov. There is on her long lips the same mocking half-smile. The martyred line of the brows is still sharper, and the sleeves of her dress are now puffed out above the shoulders. She has already passed 50, 1833 to 1918, but her character is still the same, neurotically naughty. Her hysterical fits culminate sometimes into convulsions. During these last 6 years of life, poor old unwanted Nikolai Gavrilovich translates with machine-like steadiness volume after volume of George Weber's Universal History for the publisher Nabokov. At the same time, moved by his ancient, irrepressible need to air his opinions, he tries gradually to smuggle through Weber some of his own ideas. He signs the translation Andreev. At his review of the first volume, The Examiner, February 1884, a critic remarks, "This is a kind of pseudonym, since in Russia there are as many Andreevs as there are Ivanovs and Petrovs." This is followed by a stinging allusion to the heaviness of the style, and by a small reprimand. There was no need for Mr. Andreev to dilate in his foreword on the merits and demerits of Weber, who has long been known to the Russian reader. His textbook came out as early as the 50s, and simultaneously 3 volumes of his Course of Universal History in the translation of Ian V. Korsch. He would be well advised not to ignore the works of his predecessors. E. Korsch, a lover of the arch-Russian terminology instead of that accepted by German philosophers, was by now an 80-year-old man, an assistant of Soldatnikov's. In his capacity he proofread the Astrakhan translator, introducing corrections which enraged Chernyshevsky, who in letters to the publisher set about mauling Evgeny Fedorovich according to his old system, at first demanding furiously that the proofreading be given to somebody else who understands better that there is not another man in Russia who knows the Russian literary language as well as I do, and then when he had got his own way, employing another device. Can I really be interested in such trifles? However, Korsch wants to continue to read the proofs. Ask him to make corrections. They are indeed ridiculous. With no less bitter pleasure, he also mauled Zareshian, who out of goodness of his heart had spoken to Soldatnikov regarding a monthly payment of 200 rubles to Chernyshevsky in view of Olga Sokartovna's extravagance. "You are fooled by the effrontery of a man whose mind has been befuddled by drunkenness," wrote Chernyshevsky to Soldatnikov, and settling in motion the whole apparatus of his logic, rusty, creaky, but still as wriggly as ever. He had first justified his ire by the fact that he was being taken for a thief who wished to acquire capital, and then explained that his anger was actually only a sham for Olga Sokartovna's sake. Thanks to the fact that she learned of her extravagance from my letter to you, I didn't give in to her when she asked me to soften my expression. There were no convulsions. At this point, at the end of 1888, another brief review happened along, by now on Weber's 10th volume. The terrible state of his mind, wounded pride, and an old man's crotchetiness, and the last hopeless attempts to shout down the silence, a feat even more difficult, and then Lear's attempts to shout down the storm. All this must be remembered when you read through his spectacles. The review on the inside of the pale pink cover of the Messenger of Europe. Unfortunately, it appears from the foreword that the Russian translator has remained true to his simple duties as a translator only in the first 6 volumes, but beginning with the 7th volume, he has laid upon himself a new duty, to clean up Weber. It is hardly possible to be grateful to him for the kind of translation where the author is refurbished, and such an authoritative author at that, as Weber. It would seem, remarks Stranyalupski here, somewhat mixing his metaphors, that with his careless kick of destiny had given the last suitable touch to the chain of retribution it had forged for him. But that is not so. There remains for our inspection one more, most terrible, most complete, ultimate punishment. Of all the madmen who tore Chernyshevsky's life into shreds, the worst was his son. Not the youngest, of course, Misha, who lived a quiet life, lovingly working away at a tariff questions. He was employed by the railroads department. He had been evolved from his father's positive number, and was a good son, for at the time, 1896-98, when his prodigal brother, which makes a moralistic picture, was publishing his fantastic tales and a collection of futile poems, he was piously beginning his monumental edition of his late father's works, which he had practically brought into conclusion when he died in 1924, surrounded by general esteem 10 years after Alexander Sasha had died suddenly in simple Rome. In a small room with a stone floor, declaring a superhuman love for Italian art and crying in the heat of wild inspiration that if people could only listen to him, life would be different. Created apparently out of everything that his father could not stand, Sasha, hardly out of his boyhood, developed a passion for everything that was weird, chimerical, and incomprehensible to his contemporaries. He lost himself at ETA, Hoffman, and Edgar Poe, was fascinated by pure mathematics, and a little later he was one of the first in Russia to appreciate the French poets maudits. His father, vegetating in Siberia, was unable to look after the development of his son, who was brought up by the Pipins, and when he learned, he interpreted it his own way. the more so since they concealed Sasha's mental disease from him. Gradually, however, the purity of his mathematics began to irritate Chernyshevsky, and one can easily imagine with what feelings the youth used to read those long letters from his father, beginning with a deliberately debonair joke, and then, like the conversations of that Chekhov character who used to begin so well, an old alumnus, you know, an incurable idealist, concluding with irate abuse. The passion for mathematics enraged him not only as a manifestation of something non-utilitarian, by jeering at everything modern. Chernyshevsky, whom life had outdistanced, would unburden himself concerning all the innovators, eccentrics, and failures of the world. His kindred cousin Pippin, on January 1875, sends him to Vilysk an embellished description of his student's son, informing him of what might please the creator Rakhmetov. Sasha, he wrote, had ordered an 18-pound metal ball for gymnastics, and what must be flattering to any father, with restrained tenderness, Pippin, recalling his youthful friendship with Nikolai Gavrilovich, to whom he was much indebted, relates that Sasha is just as clumsy, just as angular as his father's was, and also laughs as loud in the same treble tones. Suddenly, in the autumn of 1877, Sasha joined the Nevsky infantry regiment, and before he reached the active army, the Russo-Turkish war was in progress. He fell ill with typhus, and the constant misfortune one is aware of a legacy from his father, who also used to break everything and drop everything. Returning to St. Petersburg, he lived alone, giving lessons and publishing articles on the theory of probability. After 1882, his mental ailment was aggravated, and the more than once he tried to be placed in a nursing home. He was afraid of space, or more exactly, he was afraid of slipping into a different dimension, and in order to avoid perishing, he clung continuously to the safe, solid, with Euclidean pleats, skirt of Pelagia Nikolovna Thunderlift, nay Pippin. From Chernyshevsky, who had now moved to Astrakhan, they continued to hide this, with a kind of sadistic obstinacy, with pedantic callousness matching that of any preposterous bourgeois in Dickens or Balzac. He called his son in his letters a big ludicrous freak and an eccentric pauper, and accused him of a desire to remain a beggar. Finally, Pippin could stand it no longer, and explained to his cousin that a certain warmth that altogether Sasha may not have become a cold and calculating businessman. He had, in compensation, acquired a pure and honorable soul. And then Sasha came to Astrakhan. Nikolai Gavrilovich saw those radiant, bulging eyes, heard that strange, evasive speech, having entered the service of the oilman noble, and having entrusted to accompany a barge load along the Volga. Sasha, en route, one sultry, oil-soaked, satanic noon, knocked the bookkeeper's cap off, threw the keys into the rainbow water, and went home to Astrakhan. That same summer, 4 of his poems appeared in the Messenger of Europe. They show a gleam of talent. If life's hours appear to you bitter, do not rail against life, for it's best to admit it's your fault you've been born with an affectionate heart in your breast, and if you do not wish to acknowledge even such a self-evident fault, incidentally, let us note the ghost of an additional syllable in life's hours, matching zhin instead of zhin, which is extremely characteristic of unbalanced Russian poets. Zhin. Of the woe-begone sort, a flaw corresponding, it would seem, to something lacking in their lives, something that might have turned life into song. The last line quoted was, however, an authentic poetic ring. The joint domicile of father and son was a joint hell. Chernyshevsky drove Sasha to agonizing insomnia with his endless abominations. As a materialist, he had the fanatic effrontery to suppose that the main cause of Sasha's disorder was his pitiful material condition, and he himself suffered in a way that he had not done even in Siberia. They both breathed easier when that winter Sasha went away, at first to Heidelberg with the family in which he was tutor, and then to St. Petersburg because of the need to get medical advice. Petty, falsely funny misfortunes continued to spatter him. Thus we learned from a letter of his mother's, 1888, that while Sasha was pleased to go out for a stroll, the house in which he was living burned down, and everything he possessed burned with it, and by now utterly destitute, he moved to the country house of Stranyulivsky, the critic's father. In 1889, Chernyshevsky received permission to go to Saratov. Whatever emotions this might have awakened in him, these were in any case poisoned by the intolerable family worry. Sasha, who had always had a pathological passion for exhibitions, suddenly undertook a most extravagant and happy trick to the notorious Exposition Universelle in Paris, having at first got stuck in Berlin, where it was necessary to send him money to the consul's name with a request to dispatch him back. But no, when he received the money, Sasha made his way back to Paris, had his fill of the wonderful wheel of the gigantic filigree tower, and again was penniless. Chernyshevsky's feverish work on huge masses of Weber, which turned his brain into a forced labor factory and represented in fact the greatest mockery of human thought, did not cover unlooked-for expenditures, and day after day, dictating. He felt that it could not go on turning world history into rubles, and in the meantime he was also tormented by the panicky fear that from Paris Sasha would come crashing into Saratov. On October 11th, he wrote Sasha that his mother was sending him money for his return to St. Petersburg, and for the millionth time advised him to take a job and do anything that his superiors might tell him to do. Your ignorant, ridiculous sermons to your superiors cannot be tolerated by any superiors. Thus ends the theme of writing exercises. Continuing to twitch and mutter, he sealed the envelope and himself went to the station to mail the letter. Through the town whirled a cruel wind, which on the very first corner chilled the hurrying, angry little old man in his light coat. The following day, despite a fever, he translated 18 pages of close print. On the 13th he wanted to continue, but he was persuaded to desist. On the 14th delirium set in. Igna, ink, nonsense, words, then a sigh. I'm quite unsettled. Paragraph. If some 30,000 Swedish troops could be sent to Schleswig-Holstein, they would easily rout all the Danes' forces and overrun all the islands, except, perhaps, Copenhagen, which will resist stubbornly, but in November, in parentheses put to the 9th, Copenhagen also surrendered, the Swedes turned the whole population of the Danish capital into shining silver, banished the energetic men of the patriotic parties to Egypt. Yes, where was I? New paragraph. Thus he rambled on for a long time, jumping from an imaginary Weber to some imaginary memoirs of his own, laboriously discoursing about the fact that the smallest fate of this man had been decided. There was no salvation for him. Although microscopic, a tiny particle of pus has been found on his blood. His fate has been decided. Was he talking about himself? Was it in himself that he felt this tiny particle that had kept mysteriously impairing all he did and experienced in life? A thinker, a toiler, a lucid mind populating his utopias with an army of stenographers, he had now lived to see his delirium taken down by a secretary. On the night of the 16th he had a stroke. He felt the tongue in his mouth to be somewhat thick, after which he soon died. His last words at 3 a.m. on the 17th were, "A strange business. In this book there is not a single mention of God. It is a pity that we do not know precisely which book he is reading to himself." Now he lay surrounded by the dead tomes of Weber. A pair of spectacles in their case kept getting into everybody's way. 61 years had passed since that year of 1828, when the first omnibuses had appeared in Paris, and when a Saratov priest had noted down in his prayer book, July 12th, and the 3rd hour of morning, a son born, Nikolai, christened the morning of 13th before Mass, Godfather, Archpriest Fyod Steph Vyazovsky. This name was subsequently given by Chernyshevsky to the protagonist and narrator of Siberian novellas, and by a strange coincidence it was thus, or nearly thus, F.V. Ski, that an unknown poet signed in the magazine Century, 1909 November, 14 lines dedicated, according to information which we possess, to the memory of N.G. Chernyshevsky, a mediocre but curious sonnet which we were to give in full. What will it say, your far descendant's voice, lauding your life or blasting it outright? That it was dreadful, that another might have it less bitter, that it was your choice, that your high deed prevailed, it did ignite your dry work with the poetry of good, and crowned the white brow of chained martyrhood with a closed circle of ethereal light.